Now, one consequence of this of masculinity, of doing this extreme version of masculinity, is harm to self. How do we know this? Well, because one element of hypermasculinity is being a risk taker. Risk taking is dangerous. Young men are more likely to die between the ages of 18 to 25. And a lot of that is related not just to violence, which we'll be talking about in a second, but it's related to accidents as well as self-harm. So accidents, young men are less likely to wear a seatbelt than young women. Young men are more likely to engage in unsafe behaviors, everything from unsafe sex to speeding and reckless driving. If you've ever watched any of those stupid YouTube videos, young men are much more likely to young women to do those types of dangerous pranks and stunts that can result in injury, disability, or death. And unlike young women, who risk-taking isn't a part of the feminine ideal, it is much safer and easier for a young woman to say, without fear of being gender police, like, hey, slow the car down, I'm scared. Or, hey, you know what, maybe we shouldn't jump off this bridge, this seems dangerous. Think once again about that man box. And, depending on the circles that you run with and the context that you're in, if you're a young man saying these things, you might find your behavior it receives pushback as people try to keep you in that man box by saying things like, what, are you a chicken? Are you a sissy? Are you being a girl? Right? And so that does encourage this risk-taking behavior. Then self-harm. Alcoholism and binge drinking rates are much higher for young men between the ages of 18 to 25 than young women. I've already said that, suicide rates, we talk about the rising rate of suicide among young people, but we oftentimes don't mention that this is also very gendered. The number of young men who commit suicide is much higher than young women. And once again, if you're thinking about why, think about the long-term implications of forcing upon boys this anti-empathy training, of teaching them that it's not okay to cry, to not show emotion, to not talk about their feelings. And if they also find themselves in situations where they don't have friends that can provide a safe space to be their real selves, if they are in friendships and on sports teams and in families where they have to keep the mask up, right? How this can be contributing to unhappiness with their self and despair, in the sense that they have no one to turn to and talk to. If we switch to adult men, we know that compared to women, men are more likely to take on dangerous jobs, and they're less likely to use safety precautions on those dangerous jobs. It goes right back to what we talked about when we were talking about risk-taking. The idea that, practicing safety is somehow seen as being less manly. And men are less likely to practice self-care. When I teach the family class, I have a joke where I say, hey, man, if you want to live on average 15 years longer and you're heterosexual, you need to make sure that you get married. And it's true. One marriage benefit that exists for men, but not for women, meaning married wives don't live longer than single women, but married men live significantly longer than single men. That is an established benefit in the research. And although there might be numerous reasons as to why that exists, a lot of it does have to do with self-care. That having a wife makes you more likely to eat a balanced diet. And maybe even more importantly, having a wife increases the likelihood that you will make and keep regular doctor's appointments, which as you age become necessary for certain wellness checks. So this idea that real men take risk, and real men don't practice self-care, real men, don't worry about safety. Real men, don't drink wussy drinks and drink straight liquor and drink a lot of it. Real men don't cry. Real men don't go to therapy. All of this contributes, these messages that exist in that ideal of masculinity, it contributes to men causing a lot of harm to themselves. It also contributes to them also causing a lot of harm to others. So in the same way that suicide rates are gendered, violence against other people is gendered as well. So it's worth noting that men are more likely to be both the victims as well as the killers when we look at our statistics in regards to violence. And that's because male on male violence rates are very high. Male on female violence rates are also high. Female on male violence rates are comparatively much lower, and female on female violence rates are the lowest of all. So why are men so violent to each other? Why are they so violent to women, particularly their intimate partners, but as well as strange women they do not know? Once again, you might want to look at, this is what happens in a society that perhaps encourages anti-empathy training, that encourages people to be violent. We'll talk about it more, especially in regards to women later, but that puts out this idea that women are a prize, that men deserve to win. This leads to something that we call thwarted entitlement. The idea that men feel entitled to attention from a woman, they feel entitled to loyalty from a woman, they feel entitled to a smile from a strange woman on the street. And certainly not all men, hashtag not all men, but certainly for some men, when they do not receive that from women, they are liable to lash out violently. And in terms of male on male violence, when you have men who have been socialized with these messages about being aggressive and the importance of being respected, accorded this certain level of respect, and all types of things being potentially labeled as a sign of disrespect, it's perhaps unsurprising that you are setting the tone, you're setting the context, you're setting up the situation where men are going to mislabel each other's actions as being disrespectful, and perhaps feel like the only recourse of action once they've been disrespected is a violent one. And so, looking beyond, physical assault and murder rates, we also know that men are more likely to join gangs. They're more likely to enact suicide bombings. They are much more likely to be serial killers and mass murderers than women, and they're more likely to join violent hate groups. And for those last two, I give you additional articles if you want to read more about that. But yeah, a lot of the percentage of violence in our country that's committed by men is just staggering. Whether you're talking armed robberies, where it's 86 to 14%, whether you're talking murder, where it's 10%, 90%, whether you're talking domestic violence incidents, 86 to 14, whether you're talking self-harm in the form of suicide, 87 to 13%. Men in this country commit a staggeringly high amount of violence in comparison to women. And like I said, please resist that knee-jerk urge to say, well, that's because men are just more violent than women. Because once again, going back to our chapter on biological differences, that is not in fact true. We know that testosterone, that there is a hormonal feedback loop, but there's also this placebo effect. We know that we can look at different cultures, past and present, and know that this isn't how it has to be. And because it's not how it has to be, that means that it's not natural. It is socially constructed. And the social construction being that we have created this concept of masculinity, and then this heightened definition of masculinity, hypermasculinity, and men who feel pressured to uphold masculinity, hegemonic masculinity, and particularly hypermasculinity, find themselves at risk of self-harm or harm to others. And so this is why, if you've ever heard that term toxic masculinity, this is why we refer to it as being toxic, because toxic masculinity refers to the strategic enactments of masculinities that are harmful to both the men who enact them and the people around them. Now, the authors conclude, do they conclude that hegemonic masculinity and toxic masculinity are the exact same thing? They don't. What they say is while the hegemonic ideal is not the same as the toxic versions that are drawn from it, men's efforts to live up to it can be harmful. Right? So they're not saying that the hegemonic ideal necessarily is toxic. More like toxic masculinity is the worst spinoff of the hegemonic ideal. But because this ideal does exist, and there are these social pressures to uphold it, that can be harmful to the men themselves and to other people in their lives. So, why don't they just say screw it, right? Why don't they repudiate it and be like, I reject this definition? Well, before your book gets into why, they instead kind of provide some information on what most men are more likely to do, because they note that most men don't repudiate the hegemonic ideal. Instead, they do what is called a patriarchal bargain. And this is a deal in which an individual or a group accepts or even legitimates some of the cost of the patriarchy in exchange for receiving some of its rewards. And they note that both men and women enact patriarchal bargains, but their motivations differ. And they say for men, part of why they accept to some degree the subordination in the hierarchy of masculinity is because it allows them to claim a higher status than women, as well as some other men. So basically it's like, this is referring to the men who aren't at the top of the hierarchy pyramid. And it's like, hey, I would rather there be this pyramid, even if I'm not at the top, because at least there are people below me. But your book notes that very few men make these bargains out of a desire for power. So very few are that overt in their desire to be empowered and have power over other people. They say a lot of these bargains are initially made and continue to be made because what they really just want is a desire to be happy, to have some level of social esteem, and have some self-protection from that gender policing that, particularly for men in certain contexts, can be potentially violent and even life-threatening. And so they make these bargains because they're like, hey, if this is the dominant model, I really don't agree with this model, but I really don't want to be bullied. I really don't want to be harassed. I really want to get a promotion at my job. I really want, this to have friends and to have romantic partners. And so they make a bargain, right? They're like, no, I'm not going to be on the forefront, fighting to tear this model down. I'm going to uphold it in some ways. And we've already talked about the fact that very few people uphold it perfectly. Most of us are out there some way cutting a deal with that dominant definition. And then if we get caught, deviating, we offer some type of an account to people as a way to avoid societal backlash. But what's really worth noting is that when men cut this patriarchal bargain, when they accept this patriarchal bargain, it involves valuing other men over women, because by supporting the patriarchy in its current form, it is the acknowledgement that, women are nowhere in that hierarchy of men, that women do not experience that the privilege of male bodiedness. Some women can experience some benefits if they appropriate some aspects of masculinity, i.e. your tomboys when you're little, your top female athletes in sports associated more so with men, like basketball. um, women to some degree in corporate America, if they're willing to make the patriarchal bargain of emphasizing the ways in which they are just like their male counterparts. Um, but for a lot of women, this modified patriarchy doesn't come with a lot of benefits. And so, for the average guy to make this bargain in order to enjoy this social esteem and self protection, regardless of his personal reasons for making that bargain, he is aligning himself with men. Against the interest of women. And your book gives two examples of this. They talk about, like, telling the sexually demeaning jokes, even in front of women who might find them upsetting or controversial, but instead you prioritize the male bonding aspect of the joke over making your female counterpart uncomfortable. And then they talk about the gay male fraternity, which it was created around two identities, gayness and maleness, but while they welcome other men, so the maleness part of it, what they don't welcome are lesbians. And they only allow them to interact with the fraternity. They said in the little sister subservient kind of status. So if you think about this concept of the patriarchal bargain, and why the average guy upholds this modified patriarchy, even though it results in this hierarchy of men, of masculinity that they are probably not on the top of, and even though hegemonic masculinity can be very oppressive and harmful, they uphold it to still get these benefits. And so if you think about it this way, it really shines a different light on Gamergate, which your textbook discusses, and I give you an additional article if you want to read more about that, as well as the incel communities, incel standing for involuntary celibate. Because in these communities, right, these are oftentimes men who are complicit masculinity at best. Very few of these men that the Gamergate incident or incel communities, these are not your hegemonic ideals, but oftentimes their acceptance of gender inequality, their perpetuation of gender stereotypes, and in both of these cases, their perpetuation of gendered violence against women, it's like they are rigorously defending and fighting to uphold a system that they're not even in the top of. And your book makes this point that paradoxically, it may be the men who benefit the least from hegemonic masculinity, as well as the men who benefit the most who defend it most aggressively. And, of course, it makes sense why the people who benefit the most defend it aggressively. That's some, nah-duh logic, right? If it works for you, you don't care about other people, why would you not want it to keep working for you? But the fact that people who, like, rationally looking at it, it's like, this system isn't really benefiting you. So the fact that a lot of those people also work so hard to uphold it, as your book notes, that is paradoxical. Now, certainly, especially in contemporary society, there have been men who are pushing back against this dominant model. And your book calls this kind of contemporary conception of masculinity hybrid masculinities. And so, what do these hybrid masculinities, look like? And so to think about hybrid masculinities is they selectively incorporate symbols, performances, and identities that society typically associates with either women or low status men. And so they might mix some of these feminine aspects into their personalities, into their lifestyles. They might, in terms of their gender expression, and so in some ways, it is a progression away from the hegemonic masculinity ideal. Now, your book notes that for a lot of gender scholars, they feel like these hybrid masculinities are, at least in their current form, not living up to their potential. They note that a lot of them are just symbolic, and so if it's not really committed to changing and restructuring the modified patriarchy that we live in. It's like, okay, if you're not kind of committed to this like structural change, and this is just a symbolic type of gesture, what is kind of the long-term benefit of this? They note that for some of the men who adopt hybrid masculinities, they sometimes ask for extra credit for being good men. And so it's like, okay, because because I am this type of man, shouldn't I be allowed to do XYZ because you know that I have better intentions than that man over there who isn't this type of man? And so that's problematic. I kind of think about this as like the horrible kind of toxic guys that, complain about being like friend zone. And it's like, no, like just be a friend. Like it's not a zone. Like you don't get to be in a woman's life and be a friend in hopes that, you reach some magical point where now get to be more than a friend or sexually intimate. So I think about it like that type of way. Like there is no extra benefit. There should be no expectation of extra benefit for being a better guy. And then finally, your book notes that there's a tendency for the men who adopt these hybrid masculinities to use them to claim status. So it's not like they're tearing down the hierarchy of masculinity so much as, at least in their circles, in their context, they're replacing it with their own hierarchy that places them at the top. And once again, it's like, this isn't very revolutionary in terms of really redoing or addressing the system. And so in that way, at least in their current form, a lot of hybrid masculinities are in many ways just another patriarchal bargain. And although I do think your textbook is a little harsh on hybrid masculinities, I feel like we should give them a little bit of space, just because this is a relatively new form. And I think I am maybe much more hopeful than the authors that they will find their way and they will become something more revolutionary and progressive. But I say that maybe just as a optimist. I'm not going to say that I have like research that supports that progression is necessarily going to happen. And so, that question, can masculinity be good? Your book notes it's a hard question to answer. And part of it's because in a modified patriarchy, masculinity is still associated with power and is still dependent on a definition of femininity that is weak. And when you define masculinity and femininity in that way, you're going to have, as a result of that, things like sexism, androcentrism, and subordination. If we were to be able to magically strip from masculinity some of the more dominating, toxic, and compensatory behaviors and traits, there would be some good things that are left in that masculine definition, things like leadership and hard work, loyalty to family. But then, wouldn't it also be necessary to define those traits as also being possible to belong to women? Like they aren't traits that are just inherent in men. And I love the quote from that section, that good men aren't good men, they are good people, and they share good traits with women who are good people too. Like I feel like that is really important, right? This idea that, for a better society, we need to focus on being good people and not good gendered people. But in order to get to that magical spot, what that path looks like is really unclear. And part of it is because, we still have this very knee-jerk reaction to describe people as good men and good women. And then we characterize their goodness often in these gendered ways, even though it's totally unnecessary. And that raises the point, men can be good, but, do they need the concept of masculinity to be that? Why isn't it enough to just say that men are good people? And the final question, is masculinity good for men? Well, the data is much clearer there. Whether or not masculinity can be good is unclear because of just the complications of, what masculinity is, how it's perceived, um, and so forth. But that final question of, is masculinity good for men? Well, the data is much clearer on that. And the answer there is largely no. Even when we consider the self-esteem benefits that come from doing masculinity well and receiving some societal kickback, for doing so, it's still a form of oppression, and it hurts men. In whether we're talking self-harm, harm to others, and for some men, it hurts them just a little, right? Like, it was hurtful maybe when your dad told you, suck it up, don't cry, don't be a punk. But for some men, it might hurt them a lot, right? If they truly are having to wear a mask in order to fit in with that ideal, in order to not stand out, in order to avoid that violent, perhaps life-threatening gender policing, then for those men in particular, masculinity is really harmful. And so we revisit the question we start with. If both men and women are constrained by a binary gender system, why is it more women than men find the system unfair? And so the chapter provides reasons why men should find the system unfair, even those at the top of the hierarchy of masculinity. Because number one, that's not most men. And even those men who are at the top won't stay there forever. Yet, despite providing ample reasons why most men should repudiate and refute this kind of like narrow definition of masculinity, most men don't do that. Instead, they strike patriarchal bargains, and some, including those who should find it least advantageous, they defend that narrow definition of hegemonic masculinity vigorously, and in some cases, fatally. And so, your book makes that point that ironically, men who have the most to gain by rejecting the gender binary are often the ones who are most defensive about it because their grip on it is most fragile. They defend hegemonic masculinity because at the very least, it guarantees them superiority over somebody. That somebody those somebodies are women. And so that brings us to the end of this chapter. Obviously, our next chapter will be discussing women. We'll be discussing femininity. But that is it for masculinity.